Still renting that tiny room? My brother mocked at Christmas dinner. I own 3 houses now. Mom smirked. Some people never level up. I said nothing. Then my realtor called. Sir, the 14 owner estate keys are ready. Dad's glass froze halfway to his mouth. My brother Craig said it at 7:09 in the evening, between the salad course and the main. Still renting that tiny room, Joel? He said it the way he said everything, with the particular confidence of a man who has decided that life is a scoreboard and he is currently winning. He picked up his wine glass. He looked at me across the table. Aunt Ruth stopped passing the rolls. I own 3 houses now, he said. Did I tell you that? Closed on the 3rd one in October? My mother Beverly set down her fork, not because she was done eating, because she wanted her hands free for what came next, which was the slow smile she used when Craig said something she agreed with, enough to want to wear on her face. Some people never level up, she said. My father Howard poured himself more wine. He didn't look at me. He hadn't looked directly at me since I'd walked in 3 hours earlier, which was the same way he'd been looking at me, or not looking at me, for most of my adult life. He picked it up and held it the way he held things he was proud of, with a slight extension of the arm, as though the object needed a little more space to be properly appreciated. He looked at me across the table. 3 houses, he said. Did I tell you the 3rd one closed in October? Gilbert. Good area, strong rental market. He set the glass down. You should look at getting into the market, Joel. It's not too late. Beverly's smile had arrived fully now. She had the look of a woman who is enjoying a conversation that is going exactly the way she hoped it would go. Some people find their footing later, she said. She said it with the particular gentleness that is not gentle at all, the kind that is designed to sound like encouragement from a distance, but lands up close as something else. Aunt Ruth passed the rolls to Howard. Howard nodded at something Craig was saying. The Christmas tree in the corner sent colored light across the wall in a slow repeating pattern, red, then green, then blue, the same pattern it had made every December for 20 years. My phone buzzed in my jacket pocket at 7:14. I was 38 years old. I was a certified financial planner at a mid-size wealth management firm in Scottsdale, Arizona. I had a clean apartment 12 minutes from the office, no debt, and a desk drawer that contained, among other things, a brass key on a plain ring with a small paper tag that my grandfather Earl had given me 11 years ago when I was 27 and he was 81, and he'd said, in the particular way Earl said things that mattered, someday this one's yours. I said nothing to Craig. My phone buzzed in my jacket pocket at 7:14. To understand the dinner table, you have to understand the shape of the Merritt family first, because the dinner table didn't happen by accident. It was the natural conclusion of 40 years of a family that kept score. Craig was 42, 4 years older, 4 inches taller, 4 times louder. He had sold insurance for 8 years before pivoting to real estate investment, which in practice meant he had 3 properties with combined mortgage payments that I knew, from the kind of research a CFP does automatically on things that cross his desk, exceeded their rental income by somewhere between $3,000 and $4,000 a month. The 3 houses were real. The financial position behind them was not what Craig made it sound like at dinner tables. But Craig had always understood that the announcement mattered more than the underlying numbers, and the family had always been willing to accept the announcement. My mother Beverly kept a mental ledger, not of money exactly, but of position. Who was ahead, who was behind, who had validated her choices by doing well, and who had not. She had a gift for measuring people in a way that felt like love until you understood what the measurement was for. Craig measured well. He had the houses, he had the confidence, he had the way of walking into a room that Beverly had always associated with success, which was loudly and with the assumption that the room would be glad you'd come. I measured differently. My father Howard had worked 30 years in municipal water management and retired at 63, and spent most of his retirement agreeing with Beverly, which was not new behavior for him. He was a man who had made his peace with a particular arrangement and honored it consistently. I had never blamed him for it, but I had also stopped expecting anything different. Earl was my grandfather on my father's side. He'd built a small commercial real estate portfolio in Phoenix starting in the 1970s, buying properties that nobody else wanted and holding them for decades while the city grew around them. He was not a flashy man. He drove a 2004 Camry until it died. He wore the same 3 sweaters in rotation from October to April. At family dinners, he sat at the end of the table and ate slowly and watched everything and said perhaps a third of what he was thinking, which was still more than most people said because what Earl was thinking was usually precise. The family's understanding of Earl's financial situation was that he was comfortable but not wealthy, that the properties had been sold off over the years to cover his retirement costs, and that what remained was enough to live on, but not enough to matter significantly. This understanding was incorrect, but Earl had never corrected it, and I had never corrected it. And for 6 months after Lucinda Farrow sent me the trust documents, I still did not correct it. The reason Craig's 3 houses line landed the way it did at Christmas dinner was not that it was new. It was the same line he'd been running for 2 years in slightly different variations. In the summer, he set it at a barbecue. In the fall, he set it at a birthday dinner. At Thanksgiving, he'd set it adjacent, about his portfolio, his equity position, the way the Phoenix market was moving, and how you had to be in it to understand it. The houses were real. I want to be clear about that because what I knew, and what Craig didn't know I knew, was the kind of thing that could sound like sour grapes if you didn't understand the underlying numbers. The houses existed. He had the deeds. He went to the closings. What he didn't talk about at the barbecues and the birthday dinners and the Thanksgiving was that the combined mortgage on those 3 properties was running him approximately $3,400 a month more than he was collecting in rent. Not because the properties were bad investments necessarily, but because Craig had bought at the wrong moment in the market and had financed more aggressively than the income supported, and the gap between the idea of 3 investment properties and the reality of carrying 3 investment properties was being quietly absorbed by a credit line he'd opened 18 months ago. I knew this because Craig had once asked me to look over his mortgage documents before refinancing, and I had looked them over carefully, the way I look over everything carefully. And the picture in those documents was different from the picture Craig described at dinner tables. I hadn't said anything. He hadn't asked me what I thought. He'd asked me to look them over, and I'd looked them over, and when he asked if they looked okay, I'd said the terms were standard, which was true, and left the larger conversation for him to have with himself whenever he was ready. He was apparently not yet ready at Christmas. Beverly's ledger was separate from the financial one. She kept a different kind of score, the score of who was respected, who was admired, who reflected well on the choices she'd made as a mother. Craig had always scored high on Beverly's ledger. He projected. He announced. He arrived in rooms the way Beverly had always associated with the concept of a successful son, loudly and with the assumption that the room's interest was warranted. I had never scored well on Beverly's ledger and had, at some point in my early 30s, made my peace with that. Earl was my grandfather on my father's side. He'd built a small commercial real estate portfolio in Phoenix starting in the 1970s, buying properties that nobody else wanted and holding them for decades while the city grew around them. He was not a flashy man. He drove a 2004 Camry until it died. He wore the same 3 sweaters in rotation from October to April. At family dinners, he sat at the end of the table and ate slowly and watched everything and said perhaps a third of what he was thinking, which was still more than most people said because what Earl was thinking was usually precise. The family's understanding of Earl's financial situation was that he was comfortable but not wealthy, that the properties had been sold off over the years to cover his retirement costs, and that what remained was enough to live on, but not enough to matter significantly. This understanding was incorrect, but Earl had never corrected it, and I had never corrected it, and for 6 months after Lucinda Farrow sent me the trust documents, I still did not correct it. I was 27 the summer Earl asked me to help him refinance the main property on Camelback Road. He called me specifically. Not Craig, not my father, not any of the family members who were older or closer geographically. He called me because I had just passed my CFP exam and he had heard about it, and Earl operated on the principle that you use the right tool for the job and didn't apologize for having a preference. We sat at his kitchen table for 2 Saturdays with the mortgage documents spread between us, and I walked him through the numbers, and he asked questions that were better than most questions I'd gotten from clients twice his age. And by the end of the second Saturday, he'd signed the refinancing paperwork, and saved himself $600 a month in interest payments. When I was leaving, he walked me to my car. It was a hot Phoenix evening, the sky going orange over the mountains, the air still carrying the day's heat. He reached into his shirt pocket and took out a brass key on a plain ring with a paper tag and held it out to me. I asked what it was. He said it was the key to the Camelback property, the original, from when he'd bought the building in 1979. I said I didn't need it. He said he knew that. He held it out until I took it. "Someday this one's yours," he said. Then he went back inside. I put the key in the center console of my car. When I got home, I put it in my desk drawer because I didn't know what else to do with it. And I thought of it occasionally over the years the way you think of things that don't have an obvious category yet. Earl died 2 years ago, quietly in his sleep, the way he would have preferred. He was 91 and had been slowing down for a year and had seemed, in the last few months, to be finishing something rather than losing it. The family held a small service. Craig spoke about Earl's legacy. Beverly arranged the flowers. I read the room the way I always read rooms, tracking who was watching, who was performing, who was actually grieving. Howard sat in the front row and stared at the floor. Afterward, a woman named Lucinda Farrow approached me and gave me her card. She said she was Earl's estate attorney and that she'd be in touch. Earl had a way of watching people that was different from the way most people watch people. Most people watch to confirm what they already think. Earl watched to find out what he didn't know yet. He had done it his whole life, across 45 years of buying properties that other people had given up on, and it had made him, by the end, a very accurate reader of what things were worth and what they weren't. What he had seen in me, I didn't fully understand until I read the note Lucinda sent along with the trust documents, the one Earl had written himself in 2018. In it, he described his decision plainly, in the same plain language he used for everything. He wrote that Craig was a good son and a loving grandson, but that Craig's relationship with money was performative rather than foundational, and that giving Craig a large sum would damage him more than help him, because Craig had built an identity around the pursuit of wealth that would not survive the arrival of it. He wrote that I had done the opposite. I had built something real and quiet and had not announced it, and that a man who builds without announcing is a man who understands that the building is the point. He wrote that he had watched me with his mortgage documents at his kitchen table across 2 Saturdays, and that what he had seen was a person who was genuinely interested in getting the numbers right, not in impressing anyone, not in being thanked, just in getting them right. He said that was the rarest thing he had encountered in 81 years of dealing with people and their money. The note was 4 paragraphs. I have it in a folder in my desk, next to the spot where the brass key used to sit. I thought about that note sometimes in the 6 months between Lucinda's letter and Christmas dinner. Not with pride, exactly. With something quieter than pride. Something more like the feeling of understanding, finally, what something was for. 6 months before Christmas, Lucinda's letter arrived. Before that letter, my life in Scottsdale was the kind of life that doesn't photograph well. Clean apartment, reliable car, work that required precision and patience, and the willingness to stay with a number until you understood it completely. I had built a client base over 9 years through referrals, which is the slowest and most reliable way to build a client base, and I had never lost a client to a competitor, which is the number I was actually proud of when I thought about the work. I did not own property. This was the detail that gave Craig the most material at dinner tables, because in Craig's taxonomy of success, property ownership was the primary metric, the thing that sorted the serious people from the people who were still figuring it out. The fact that I rented an apartment in Scottsdale, a clean apartment that I liked, and that was 12 minutes from my office and had good light in the mornings, was something Craig treated as evidence rather than choice. What Craig did not know, because I had not told him and he had not asked, was that my investment portfolio had been compounding for 11 years at a rate that would have given him pause if he'd seen the statements. I had no mortgage because I had made a calculated decision as a CFP that leverage in the current rate environment carried risks that my income could service but my sleep could not. I preferred to own less and own it outright. Craig preferred to own more and discuss it loudly. Neither of us was wrong exactly. We had just built different things and were measuring them differently. And the measurement Craig was using required me to be losing in order for him to be winning. I read the letter twice. At my kitchen table on a Tuesday morning before work, the way I read documents that carry significant information, which is once for the words and once for what the words mean. Earl had established a revocable living trust in 2018, 6 years before he died. The trust held all his assets, the Camelback Road property, 4 additional commercial properties in the greater Phoenix area, a residential portfolio of 7 single-family homes, and investment accounts across 3 institutions. Total estate value at time of vesting, $14,240,000. Sole trustee, Joel Merritt. Sole beneficiary, Joel Merritt. I set the letter on the table. I sat back in the chair and looked at the ceiling for a moment. The ceiling was the same ceiling it had always been, white and unchanged. The ceiling of an apartment where I had lived quietly for 7 years and built something real without announcing it. $14,240,000. In properties I had been watching appreciate quietly on Lucinda's quarterly reports for the past 2 years, while Earl was still alive and the trust was still revocable. In accounts that had been compounding for decades while the family assumed there was nothing left to compound. Earl had built it the way he built everything, patiently, without commentary, with the specific intention of giving it to the person who would understand what it was for. Outside, a neighbor's sprinkler system came on. The sound of it came through the kitchen window, steady and mechanical, indifferent to everything. I almost called my father, not with the news, but just to call, to see if any part of the old arrangement still worked the way it once had when I was young, and the family was still a unit rather than a series of bilateral negotiations. What stopped me was a specific memory. The Christmas 12 years ago, when Craig announced he'd been promoted to regional sales manager, and Beverly cried, actual tears, and Howard clapped him on the shoulder, and I sat across the table having just passed my Series 65 exam, which I had not mentioned because no one had asked. I remembered the feeling of that dinner not as a wound but as a data point. The understanding of how information moved in my family, toward Craig, toward performance, toward the loudest claim, that was useful information. I had been using it quietly ever since. I put Lucinda's letter in a folder in my desk drawer next to the spot where the brass key had been sitting for 11 years, and I went to work. 2 months before Christmas, Craig posted on Facebook. The post used phrases like family inheritance rights and Earl would have wanted, and we as a family deserve to know. It had 63 comments by the time I saw it, mostly from extended relatives I hadn't spoken to in years, people who had no more information than Craig and were nonetheless forming opinions with the confidence of people who had plenty. Their attorney sent a formal challenge letter to Lucinda 2 weeks later. It cited undue influence and questioned Earl's capacity at the time of the trust formation. Lucinda sent me a copy with a note. I anticipated this. Earl anticipated this. Please see the attached documentation. The attached documentation included Earl's cognitive evaluation from 2018, conducted by a neurologist at the time of the trust's formation at Earl's specific request. It included a signed letter in Earl's own handwriting, dated the same week as the trust, describing his intentions clearly and specifically, and in language that left no room for misinterpretation. It included a note about Craig, by name, and why Earl had made the decision he had. I read that note 3 times. Then I sent Lucinda everything she needed and let the process run. The challenge itself was not, legally speaking, difficult to defeat. Earl had been methodical. The trust documents were airtight, drafted by a firm that specialized in estate planning for exactly this kind of situation, where a testator anticipates family conflict and builds the paperwork to survive it. The neurological evaluation was recent and unambiguous. The note Earl had written in his own handwriting addressed the question of undue influence directly and with more specificity than most challenge defense attorneys ever got from their clients. Lucinda told me, when the dismissal came through, that opposing counsel had been professional about it. She said that word specifically, professional, which told me that opposing counsel had read the documentation and understood what they were up against and made a reasonable decision rather than a costly one. She said the grounds they had filed on were the standard ones, capacity and undue influence, and that both had been thoroughly anticipated and addressed by Earl years before anyone filed anything. What she didn't say, but what I understood from reading the dismissal order, was that the challenge had probably cost Craig and my parents somewhere between $10,000 and $15,000 in legal fees for a result that had been predetermined by the quality of the documentation Earl had spent 2 years assembling. 2 weeks before Christmas, the challenge was dismissed. I did not call Craig. I did not call Beverly. In the week before Christmas, I gave Douglas Vance, my colleague at the firm, one set of the trust documents in a sealed envelope with instructions to open it only if I called and asked him to. Lucinda had a second set at her office, as always. A third went into my bag alongside the toiletries and the book I probably wouldn't read. Nothing said to anyone in my family. The brass key went into the inside pocket of my jacket 3 days before the flight, and it stayed there through the airport and the boarding and the descent into Phoenix and the rental car and the drive to my parents' house in Scottsdale. I booked the flight and put the brass key in my jacket pocket. The Merritt family Christmas dinner was held at my parents' house in Scottsdale, the same house where Craig and I had grown up, the same dining room table that had hosted 30 years of holiday meals, and the particular species of family conversation that happens when people who love each other have also, over time, learned exactly where the other person is vulnerable and developed the habit of testing it. Aunt Ruth had driven from Tucson. She sat to my left and asked about my apartment and whether I was seeing anyone, the standard inventory of questions relatives ask when they don't know how else to express that they've been thinking of you. I answered honestly and without elaboration, which is how I answer most questions at family dinners. Craig arrived 20 minutes late, which he had always done because arriving late meant arriving to a room that was already waiting. He came in with his jacket on and his phone in his hand and the particular energy of a man who has information he is waiting for the right moment to deploy. Beverly had made the roast she made every year. Howard had set the table and was already on his second glass of wine. The Christmas tree was in the corner with the ornaments that hadn't changed in 20 years. We sat. We ate the salad. Howard poured more wine. Then Craig said it. He set down his fork with the small, deliberate click of a man making a point. He looked at me. Still renting that tiny room, Joel? The table felt the question the way tables feel questions that are not actually questions. Aunt Ruth stopped reaching for the rolls. Beverly's face went to the smile. Craig leaned back. He ran through the 3 houses, the October closing, the deal he was working on in Gilbert, the way the Phoenix market was moving. He spoke for 4 minutes and 30 seconds, which I know because I was watching the time on my phone, which was sitting face up on the table next to my water glass. At the end of it, Beverly said, "Some people never level up," and Howard poured wine, and the table resettled into the quiet that follows a performance. My phone buzzed at 7:14. I looked at the screen. Lucinda Farrow. I excused myself and went out to the back porch. I had been on that back porch before, many times over the years at various Merritt family dinners, whenever the house got loud in the way family houses get loud, and I needed 3 minutes of something that wasn't noise. It was a concrete slab with a wrought iron rail and 2 chairs Beverly had bought at a home goods store in 2011 and never replaced. The neighbor's pool was visible over the fence, turquoise under the lights, and in the summer it glowed at night like a lit aquarium. In December it was dark and covered. Standing on that porch with my phone in my hand and Lucinda's call just finished, I thought briefly about what it would feel like to go back inside and say nothing, to finish dinner, to drive back to my apartment, to let Craig have his 3 houses and Beverly have her smirk and Howard have his wine glass, and leave them all exactly where they were in the story they'd built about who was doing well and who wasn't. I thought about it for less than 2 seconds. Then I thought about the key in my jacket pocket and about Earl at his kitchen table across 2 Saturdays with the mortgage documents, and about the hot Phoenix evening when he'd held the key out until I took it. And I understood that saying nothing was never actually an option. It was just the shape of what patience looks like before it becomes something else. The Arizona night was cold in the way desert nights are cold, sharp and clear, the sky overhead more stars than you remember stars being. I stood on the concrete porch with my jacket on and answered the call. Lucinda's voice was the same as it always was, measured and professional, the voice of a woman who had delivered significant news enough times to understand that the news does not need decoration. "Mr. Merritt," she said, I wanted to let you know personally. The transfer documents are finalized. The keys for all properties are ready at our office whenever you'd like to come in. You're free to take possession at your convenience." I thanked her. I told her I'd come in after the new year. She said to enjoy my Christmas. I stood on the porch for a moment after hanging up. The neighbor's pool pump was running. A dog barked somewhere down the street and stopped. The kitchen light came through the glass door behind me, and inside I could see Craig gesturing at something and Beverly nodding and Howard with his glass. I had known this call was coming. I had known it for 6 months. And I had chosen this week, this dinner, not as a performance, not to rub anything in, but because this was when I was going to be here anyway. And because there was something I'd been carrying in my jacket pocket for 3 days that needed to go back where it belonged. I took the brass key out of my pocket, held it for a moment, then I went back inside. I went back inside through the kitchen door. The warmth of the house came at me all at once after the cold of the porch. Beverly was topping up the water glasses. Aunt Ruth was asking Howard something about his garden. Craig was leaning back in his chair with his wine glass in his hand, talking about a complication with the title search on the Gilbert property. I sat down. I picked up my fork. I ate a bite of roast, which was good the way Beverly's roast was always good. The one consistent thing at 30 years of merit Christmas dinners. The candle between the gravy boat and the bread basket burned at about half its original height. The tree in the corner threw colored light across the wall. Craig finished the Gilbert story. Beverly made a sympathetic sound. Howard refilled his glass. Then the table resettled into the particular silence that follows a story about a real estate complication, which is a silence in which everyone is pretending to be interested in the food while actually waiting for the next thing to say. I set down my fork. Craig was mid-sentence when I sat back down. Something about the Gilbert property, a complication with the title search. I picked up my fork. I ate for 30 seconds. I let him finish his sentence. Then I set the brass key on the tablecloth. I set it in the center of the table, on the white cloth between the gravy boat and the candle, where everyone could see it. A brass key on a plain ring with a paper tag, worn at the edges from 11 years in a desk drawer. No one said anything. I said, "Earl's estate closed yesterday." I reached into my jacket and put 3 documents on the table. The trust instrument, first page only, with Earl's signature, and the date and the beneficiary line. Lucinda's letter confirming the dismissal of the challenge, and the estate summary, 1 page, with the asset list and the total at the bottom, $14,240,000. I said, "He set up the trust in 2018. I've been the trustee since then." Craig's mouth opened. Beverly looked at the documents, then at Craig, then at the documents again. I said, "The challenge your attorney filed was dismissed 2 weeks ago. Lucinda's letter is the 3rd page." Howard's wine glass was halfway to his mouth. It stopped there. He didn't put it down, and he didn't drink from it. He simply held it at that angle, suspended, while his eyes moved from the key to the paper to my face. Aunt Ruth picked up the trust document. She read the beneficiary line. She set it back down carefully, the way you set down something that belongs to someone else. Craig found his voice. He said the trust wasn't valid, that Earl hadn't been himself in his last years, that the family had been left out of decisions they should have been part of. He said they had rights, and that a trust put together without the family's knowledge wasn't something that could just be presented at Christmas dinner like a done deal. He was using the we language again, the collective family we that had never actually operated as a collective on anything except the business of deciding that Craig was the successful one and I was the one who hadn't gotten there yet. The we that showed up whenever there was something to claim or a position to defend and disappeared whenever there was a cost to share. I watched him talk. His face had the color of a man who has been walking towards something and has just realized the ground under him is not what he thought it was. Beverly's hands were flat on the table. She was looking at the estate summary, the 1 page with the assets listed and the total at the bottom, and her face had the particular stillness of a person whose mental ledger is being revised in real time. Howard was still holding his wine glass at the angle where it had stopped. Aunt Ruth had not said anything. She was reading the trust document again, slowly, her finger moving across the beneficiary line as though she was confirming that the words still said what they'd said the first time. They did. I let Craig finish. He went on for 2 minutes. He used the word blindsided 3 times. He mentioned Earl's age, his health in the last years, the idea that someone might have taken advantage of an old man's attachment to a favorite grandchild. That last phrase hung in the room. I slid the second page across to him. Lucinda's letter, the dismissal, the date at the top, December 11th, 2 weeks ago. He picked it up. I watched his eyes move down the first paragraph, and then the second, and then stop at the third, where the language became specific about the grounds for dismissal and the quality of the documentation supporting the trust's validity, including the neurological evaluation Earl had requested himself in 2018, specifically because he had anticipated exactly this kind of challenge. His jaw tightened. He set the letter down. Beverly said, "Joel, this is a family matter." I said, "I know." That was the 5th sentence I'd spoken since sitting back down. The candle burned. The roast was still warm. Howard set his wine glass on the table without drinking from it, the small sound of glass on cloth, the only sound in the room. Craig looked at the key. The brass key on the worn ring sitting on the white tablecloth between the gravy boat and the candle. He looked at it the way you look at something when you're trying to understand what it means and the meaning is coming in too fast. He didn't say anything else. 4 things happened in the weeks after Christmas dinner that I want to tell you as scenes, because they are scenes, not a list. The first was Craig, 2 mornings later, sitting at his own kitchen table with his phone face down and 3 mortgage statements in front of him. His wife asked him something from the other room, and he said he was fine. He wasn't fine. He was doing the math on what the inheritance he had been counting on, in the private accounting of his own planning, would have covered. The Gilbert property deal fell through in January. He listed one of the 3 houses in February. The second was the envelope that arrived at my parents' house in early January, addressed to Howard and Beverly from the family attorney. It was the final billing statement for the challenge they had filed. $14,000 in legal fees for a challenge that had lasted 6 weeks and accomplished nothing. Beverly called me that evening. She said it was a lot of money for a misunderstanding. I told her I was sorry it had cost what it had. She waited for me to say something else. I didn't say anything else. After a moment, she said goodnight and hung up, and I sat with the phone in my hand and listened to the silence of my apartment. The third was Lucinda's office on the 2nd of January. She had all the keys laid out on a clean cloth on her conference table. 12 keys total, 1 for each property, each on its own labeled ring. She walked me through the transfer documents one by one, and I signed where I needed to sign. And at the end, she shook my hand and said Earl had been very specific about his intentions and very clear about why, and that she was glad it had gone the way it had. I want to say something about the fallout that I think is important, because the story told from the outside could sound like a victory in a way that isn't quite accurate to how it felt from the inside. What I had was not a victory over Craig. What I had was a brass key and a trust document, and the knowledge that Earl had seen something in me worth preserving. Craig still had 3 houses. Beverly still had her ledger. Howard still had his way of not looking at things directly. None of that changed because of Christmas dinner. What changed was simpler. The story the family had been telling about who I was, which was the story of the one who hadn't gotten there, could no longer be maintained without everyone in the room knowing it was a story. That is a different thing from winning. It is closer to clarity. The fourth was Aunt Ruth, who texted me on New Year's Day. No context, no explanation, just, "Earl always said you were the one who listened." I read it twice. I typed back, "He was good at knowing things." She replied with a single thumbs up, and that was the whole exchange, and it was right. 6 months after Christmas dinner, I went to the Camelback Road property for the first time as its owner. It was a Sunday morning in June, the early kind when the Phoenix heat hasn't arrived yet, and the air is still and the desert light comes in at an angle that makes everything look deliberate. I drove the 12 minutes from my apartment and parked on the street and sat in the car for a moment. The building was a low commercial structure, brick, unremarkable from the outside. Earl had bought it in 1979 for $42,000 when the neighborhood around it was still undecided about what it wanted to be. He had waited for 45 years while it decided, and it had decided well. The area around Camelback Road in the 1970s had been sparse desert commercial, the kind of block where businesses came and went without leaving much impression. Now it sat within walking distance of restaurants and offices and hotels, and the kind of retail that follows money once money has settled somewhere. The property's assessed value in the most recent county records was $2.3 million, which was what $42,000 becomes when a patient man holds it for 45 years and does nothing dramatic with it except replace the roof twice. Earl had never sold it. Developers had approached him 3 times that I knew of from the estate documents. He had declined all 3 times without explanation, at least not to them. In the note he left with Lucinda, the one he'd written alongside the trust documents, he mentioned the building once. He wrote, "I have kept the Camelback property because it reminds me that the right thing to do with something real is to hold it." I read that line more than the others. He had replaced the roof twice and the HVAC once and repainted the exterior in 2007. He had never sold it. I got out of the car. I walked to the front door. I put the brass key in the lock. The door swung open into Earl's hallway, and the morning light came through the windows and fell across the floor the same way it must have fallen every morning for 45 years, steady and unhurried, the light of a building that had been waiting without impatience. I stood in the doorway for a moment. The key was still in the lock behind me. Earl had seen something in me that the family dinner table had spent 30 years talking over. He hadn't argued with the table. He hadn't made a speech. He had simply put a key in his shirt pocket one hot evening and held it out until I took it. And then he had gone back inside, and he had been right, the way patient people are right, without needing to announce it. Some people never level up. The phrase came back to me in that hallway, the way Beverly had said it at the dinner table, with the tree throwing colored light on the wall and Howard reaching for the wine. It had been meant as a measurement, a verdict, the conclusion of the family's accounting. Earl had done his own accounting. It had taken him 45 years, and it was sitting in a file at Lucinda's office. And it was also here, in this hallway, in this light, in this key that was now back where it had always been going. I stepped inside and pulled the door shut behind me. If this one landed for you, drop a comment, subscribe for the next one.